Alright, in this tutorial I wanted to talk about some of the settings for CamStudio. The first one I wanted to talk about is this record to SWF, record to AVI toggle switch. You'll notice as you press it, it switches between recording to AVI and recording to SWF. To go into a bit more detail here, it doesn't record directly to SWF. What it first does is record to AVI, and then once you're finished with the recording, it loads up the SWF producer and converts that AVI into an SWF file automatically. Now this kind of defeats the purpose of me telling you about this feature, but I'm actually going to recommend that you don't use this and that you leave it set to the default of record to AVI. This is because mainly the record to the SWF producer that it uses to convert the file over doesn't work quite right and produces a little bit of bugs in your file. I recommend that you record the AVI and then use another program such as Riva or something else to convert it to SWF if you really want to save into the flash file format. At least if you're using CamStudio versions 2.0 to 2.5. The next group of settings I'd like to go over are options, video options. If you look down here under frame rates, the first thing you'll notice is this capture frames every. Capture frames every something milliseconds. For those of you not familiar with the term, milli is 1/1000th. So a millisecond would be 1/1000th of a second. Basically there's 1000 milliseconds in 1 second. So what this value does right here is determine how often CamStudio will take a picture of your desktop. Since there's 1000 milliseconds in a second and CamStudio is taking a picture of the desktop every 50 milliseconds, we're going to divide 1000 by 50. That gives us 20 pictures or 20 frames captured a second. Now if you'll notice, CamStudio by default has a playback rate set to 20 frames per second. This is the same rate at which it's capturing frames. If you're capturing video and audio at the same time, you're going to want 1000 divided by whatever your capture frames every is to equal your playback rate. Otherwise your video and audio won't match up or they won't sync. You're going to risk the person who's watching your video having what they're seeing not match what they're hearing. This is why I recommend if you do happen to be capturing video and audio at the same time, you use one of these 4 settings right here. These settings are for your capture frames and these settings are for the playback rate. If you notice, they all divide equally into 1000 without having to use decimal points, and they don't leave any remainder behind. Now I've seen in some instances where people are trying to capture, let's say 30 frames per second. They figure, well, 1000 divided by 30 equals 33.333 repeating. Well, the issue here is if you say put 33.333, as many threes in there as you can here into this setting for CamStudio and hit OK. If you go back here to video options, you'll notice that CamStudio didn't store that 33.333. It stored it as 33 instead. This is because CamStudio can't store decimal values for these 3 settings right here. This creates problems because 1000 divided by 33 equals 30.303030 repeating. It's not equal to 30. And since you can't try to offset this by entering 33.333 for your capture rate, and you can't enter 30.303 for your playback rate, you're stuck entering 33 and 30 for your capture frames and for your playback rate instead. This means you're capturing frames at 30.3030 whatever frames per second, but you're only playing them back at 30 frames per second. These two values are close, but they're not exactly the same. You might be fine for a shorter clip, maybe 30 seconds or so, but once you start getting beyond that, you're going to notice your video lagging behind your audio. Another thing I've seen people do is enter something like 5 milliseconds for their capture frames and then having their playback rate be 200 frames per second. I don't recommend doing this for several reasons. For one, most PCs can't truly capture at 200 frames per second. I mean, that's 200 pictures being taken in 1 second. That can put a huge strain on a CPU. The second issue is generally the lower the capture rate, the higher the file size, because you're taking more pictures in 1 second. This can cause problems because CamStudio can't save clips larger than 2 gigabytes in size without corrupting them. At 200 frames per second, you're going to have a very large file size very quickly, and you will hit that 2 gigabyte barrier much faster than you would with a higher capture rate. The third thing is, not only are you going to end up with that larger file size and risk hitting the 2 gigabyte barrier much quicker, most people aren't going to notice much, if any, difference with a playback rate higher than 20 to 30 frames per second. Not enough to make the larger file size worthwhile anyways. Lastly, if you plan on uploading the clip to a video share site like YouTube, Vimeo, or MetaCafe, the frame rate will likely get bumped down to 30 frames per second or lower once the site gets done re-encoding the file to whatever format it uses. For this reason, I generally set my capture frames every to 100, giving me a playback rate of 10. If I don't like the way the clips turned out and I found the frame rate just not to be smooth enough, sometimes I might lower the capture frames to 50 and raise the playback rate to 20. But generally, using 100 for the capture frames and 10 for the playback rate, I've found that to work well for most material. Most of the other screencasts I've seen have been recorded using these settings as well.